Lesson 5-5, solving multi-step equations and inequalities. Okay, I want to start off by focusing on this problem on top here. Oops, number 28. The perimeter of a rectangle is 50 centimeters. The length of the rectangle is 1 more than 3 times the width of the rectangle. What are the dimensions of the rectangle? Well, let's see. We know that the perimeter of a rectangle, P, is equal to twice its length plus twice its width. Right, its perimeter is equal to 2L plus 2W. And the problem is telling us that L, its length, is equal to 1 more than 3 times the width. So 1 more than 3 times the width is written as 3W plus 1. And the question is, what are the dimensions of the rectangle? Well, if I know that L is equal to 3W plus 1, then in my equation for perimeter, I can replace L with this, right? Because they're equal, or they're the same thing, right? So I will rewrite my equation, but I will replace L with 3W plus 1 plus 2W. And I think the problem, they give us a value for the perimeter. Yes, they tell us that the perimeter is 50, right? So we know that the value for P is 50 because the problem tells us that. Okay, in fact, if they didn't tell us that, we wouldn't be able to solve this. Okay, so what we have here now is a multi-step equation that we can solve. All right. So the first thing that we probably want to do is use the distributive property to distribute my 2 to my 2 terms inside my parentheses. Right, and once again, my distributive property tells me that whenever I am adding or subtracting, whenever I am multiplying a number by a sum or a difference, I can use the distributive property by taking the number on the outside and multiplying it by every term on the inside, right? So in this case, I will multiply 2 times 3W. Right, so simplifying this, I have 2 times 3W gives me 6W. 2 times positive 1 gives me positive 2. And bringing down the rest of my equation, it already looks simpler than it did before. Okay, you may notice now that we have like terms on the right side of our equation, right? We have a positive 6W and a positive 2W. Remember, it's critical that you consider the signs, right, that come to the left of your terms, okay? So 6W plus 2W gives us 8W. 8W plus 2 on the right-hand side and 50 on the left-hand side. Alright, since our goal is to isolate our variable, we must then get rid of that positive 2 on the right-hand side, right? So we will subtract 2 on each side. On the left-hand side, 50 minus 2 is 48. And on the right-hand side, we have 8W. And the last step, to undo multiplication by 8, we will divide by 8 on each side. And we are left with W equals 48 divided by 8 is 6. Right? And to check your solution, you would take 6 and you would plug it back into your original equation. So let's make sure we've answered the question. The question says, what are the dimensions of the rectangle? Well, we figured out the width. W is 6, but we've only actually answered half the question because we want to know what the length is too. Well, we know from the equation they gave us, right, this equation right here, that the length is equal to 3w plus 1. So because I know what w is now, right, I know w is 6, I can take my value for w and plug it in. L equals 3 times 6 plus 1, right? L equals 18 plus 1. Oops, I did not want to do that. L equals 19, right? So our width is 6 centimeters and our length is 19 centimeters. Those are our two dimensions. Okay. So for the remainder of this lesson, we will be taking a look at a handful of multi-step equations and inequalities so we can become comfortable with solving them. Alright, let's try another equation. Let's consider 16 times z plus 3 is equal to 4 times z plus 9. Okay, so you may notice that on both sides of our equation we need to apply the distributive property. Right, so it really doesn't matter which side you start on. We'll start on the left-hand side. We'll just work from left to right. We will distribute the 16 to our positive z and then to our positive 3. Right, on the right-hand side we'll be distributing the positive 4 to our positive z and to our positive 9. Okay, so on the left-hand side, 16 times z gives us 16z. 16 times positive 3 gives us a positive 48. And this equals 4 times z, right? 4 times z is 4z, and 4 times positive 9 is positive 36. Okay. We now have an equation with variables on opposite sides of the equal sign. So our goal now is to get those variables, right, to get our variable z all over to the same side, right? It really doesn't matter if we bring the 4z over to the left-hand side or if we bring the 16z over to the right-hand side. That choice is really up to you, as long as you're doing the same thing to both sides, right? Alright, so why don't we do this? Why don't we subtract 4z from each side? Alright, so let's see, on the right-hand side, our 4z minus 4z cancels out, and we're left with just 36. And on the left-hand side, 16z minus 4z is 12z, right, plus 48. Now we have our variable on one side of the equal sign. Okay, our next step would be to undo addition of 48. And to do that, we will subtract 48 on each side. So on the left-hand side, we are left with 12z. And on the right-hand side, 36 minus 48 is negative 12. And lastly, to undo multiplication of 12, we will divide by 12. And keep in mind, when you're solving equations and inequalities, all you're really doing is working backwards. Right? That's all you're really doing, is working backwards to figure out the value of the unknown. Z equals negative 1. Right? And to check your solution, you would take negative 1 and plug it back in to the original equation. But for the sake of time, I will leave that up to you. Alright, let's try a couple of inequalities before we end our lesson. Let's consider the inequality 3r plus 7 times 2 is less than or equal to negative 34. Okay, now keep in mind, like I mentioned in our last lesson, solving inequalities is basically involves the same process as solving equations, right? The only difference is that you're dealing with an inequality symbol, and you have to remember that whenever you multiply or divide both sides by a negative number, your inequality sign will flip. Okay, so on the left-hand side, the first thing we should do is apply the distributive property, right? We will distribute our positive 2 to our positive 7 and to our positive 3r. So 2 times positive 3r gives us positive 6r, and 2 times positive 7 gives us a positive 14. Bringing down the rest of our problem. On the left-hand side, we will subtract 14, right? We will undo addition of 14 by subtracting 14 on each side. We are left with 6r is less than or equal to, we have negative 34 minus 14, which is the same thing as negative 34 plus negative 14, which is negative 48. Right? And then lastly, on the left-hand side, we will divide by 6, and then on the right-hand side, do the same thing to balance it out. On the left-hand side, 6 divided by 6 leaves me with 1r is less than or equal to negative 48 divided by 6 is negative 8. So r is less than or equal to negative 8. And please notice that my sign did not flip in this case. And it did not flip because I divided by a positive 6, right? Our sign only flips when we multiply or divide by a negative number. So we have time for one more. Let's try one more. Negative 2 times g minus 1 is greater than g minus 4. And if you'd like to get practice with these on your own, you can always just pause the video, try it, and then fast forward to check your answer. Okay, the first thing we need to do on the left-hand side is apply the distributive property. Negative 2 times g is negative 2g. Negative 2 times a negative 1, right, is positive 1, is greater than g minus 4. Alright, we have a term with g on the left side of the inequality and a term with g on the right side. We need to get all our g's over to one side. Okay, so we have a couple of options here, but the option, okay, that comes to mind for me is to subtract g on the right side and then to subtract g on the left-hand side. On the right side, my g's cancel, right? And I'm left with just negative 4 on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, negative 2g minus g is negative 3g plus 1. Okay. To undo addition of 1, I will take away 1 on each side. And I'm left with negative 3g is greater than negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5. And lastly, I will divide by negative 3 on each side. I am left with g is, now because I divided by a negative number, right, I divided by negative 3, my inequality symbol will flip from greater than to less than. G is less than 5/3. Right, and you can either leave it as an improper fraction, or you might want to change it to a mixed number, right? So g is less than 5/3, right? If you were to change that, to an improper fraction, what would that be? G is less than 1 2/3.